Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. We've also got a special guest on this week's episode, so it's going to be a dual episode of Podcast on the Brink and the Pin Down, Dylan Burkhardt's podcast over at UMHoops. Dylan, welcome to a joint episode of the Pin Down and Podcast on the Brink.
Yeah, we got a collaborative episode here ahead of the big game on Saturday evening in Ann Arbor. I'm excited to talk with you and talk a little bit about this matchup. It should be a kind of fun one. Yeah,
for sure. For those of you who don't know, Dylan and I have done the preseason Big Ten top 25 player list for many years now, and just developing a friendship with Dylan over many years. I've followed Michigan basketball pretty closely, so anytime these two teams get a chance to meet, like to chat with him on the matchup. Dylan, I know with the Pin Down, you do a lot of kind of breaking down the X's and O's and matchups going into the game. So this episode is going to be a little bit different for Podcast on the Brink listeners, but I think you'll enjoy it. I think we're going to talk just a lot about this matchup from a position by position perspective and some of the keys to the game and overall maybe what each team needs to do well to come out with the victory on Saturday.
That Big Ten top 25 list had Zach Edey at number 1, right?
I don't think it did.
I don't think it did. Another L for the list.
We did pretty good though. I feel like I think we did overall. I think we held our own. I mean, we've had years where we didn't even have the Big Ten Player of the Year on the top 25. So we're
okay.
At least going to have the Big Ten Player of the Year in the top 3. So I think that's pretty good, right?
That's pretty good. National Player of the Year, not number 1 on our list. So it's been better. But yeah, I think I'm excited to go through this. I think there's some interesting one-on-one matchups. So I think we can kind of just go. Do you want to start at the top or the bottom? You want to start with the guards or the bigs? I feel like we might want to just start with the bigs because that's really where this story starts. So Trayce Jackson-Davis, Hunter Dickinson, feels like these two have played against each other a half dozen times over the years. I don't know if it's actually that many, but both guys are pretty much ubiquitous with what their programs are at this point, right? Their ability to score inside, their strengths, their weaknesses all kind of define, I guess, what both of these teams are. Trayce Jackson-Davis has been playing out of his mind, obviously. Hunter Dickinson has been a little more maybe up and down than people expected this year, but I really think this is where the matchup starts. I guess, so I think the place to start is how both teams will guard the other big. Michigan almost always is going to play single coverage with Hunter Dickinson. I would be pretty surprised if they did something differently, at least to start. And I think both of these guys are probably looking forward to that challenge, right? Like Michigan would like to be single covered because they've dealt with all of these double teams. Trayce Jackson-Davis has probably dealt with every defense under the sun. So what do you make of how maybe Indiana might try to guard Hunter and vice versa?
Yeah, they've done different things, I think, depending on the opponent. With the Purdue game, obviously, it's a different beast with Zach Edey, and you have to, I think, try different things. I don't think there's one formula there that you can find success with. It's just basically trying to show different looks and hope for the best. I think this matchup's maybe a little bit different. The thing that kind of sticks in my head is Michigan maybe has a couple of guys that you don't mind leaving if you are going to send help. Doug McDaniel probably comes to mind pretty early just based on the three-point shooting numbers. Same thing with Terrence Williams, who, I've been joking with you all season. I was a big Terrence Williams guy entering the season, and obviously that hasn't really come to fruition. So I don't think Indiana is going to just go in with one game plan and say this is what we're going to do. I think they're going to adjust based on how things are going. The one thing I will say about Trayce Jackson-Davis is he's done a really good job this year of not fouling. I mean, that's why his minutes have been what they are. I mean, the last game against Rutgers, he played basically the whole second half. There was a brief spell in the first half. Usually what they do is just before the under 8 timeout, he'll come out for a little bit and then he'll come right back in. And he's been able to play so much because he's avoided foul trouble. So the one thing I wonder, being a road game and quite frankly, if you look at this matchup historically between these two guys, Hunter Dickinson has outplayed Trayce Jackson-Davis for the most part, other than the second half of the game and the Big Ten tournament. I mean, going into that game, it was basically, is Trace finally going to step up and meet the challenge of playing Hunter Dickinson, because he never had, and that was maybe kind of a breakthrough moment for him individually as a player. So I still think there's that concern from an Indiana perspective of, this is a player that's really dominated us for a long period of time. I think Hunter Dickinson shot the three well against Indiana in the past, and it just played well. So I don't necessarily think it's going to be a one size fits all and say, hey, we're going to do this every time. I think they're going to kind of see how things are going. Obviously, they want to avoid foul trouble with Trace. And I also think there's going to be some possessions where you're going to see Race Thompson on Hunter Dickinson to avoid fouling.
That's what I was going to get at. And I think you mentioned Doug McDaniel. I think from Indiana's perspective, if you're going to double Hunter Dickinson, it needs to be a big to big double. And you can play off Terrence Williams. He's by far the least confident shooter on Michigan's roster. And you can even get creative there. You can put Trace Jackson Davis on Terrence Williams, double with Trace Jackson Davis, and use Race Thompson kind of at the point of attack. Maybe keeps Trace out of foul trouble. That seems like probably the way to go if you're going to bring extra attention. And what's interesting about this matchup year over year is Michigan last year matched up really well with Indiana, where they had a second big, right? Like they had Moussa Diabate, who they could then post up on the other block, or they could use to exploit if you're trying to kind of stash someone in a different spot. And Moussa, I think, played pretty well in the game in Bloomington. And
I think everybody played pretty well that game for Michigan, right?
Yeah, but that was a big part of it, is having that other big,
right?
Kind of creates, and then at the same time, Michigan could use both bigs to defend Trace in a way that was a little differently. This Michigan team is very different, where Terrence Williams is not a great shooter, but he's also like a perimeter-oriented player, right? Most of what he does starts in the three-point line. He's not going to be hanging out at the dunker spot, hanging out on the block. He's not going to score with his back to the basket. And I don't think you worry if you're Michigan about, okay, he has to guard Race Thompson. Race Thompson's probably not a great offensive threat, right? That's not what you're really worried about. But you don't have that versatility. You can't put someone else on Trace if he gets going, or you can't put someone else on Trace to keep Hunter Dickinson out of foul trouble. So those sort of, that give and take is a little different in the front court, where this year Indiana is the team with more kind of able-bodied bigs up down in the post, and probably has better options to double or trap or do different things. So that is one place where I think this matchup is a bit different than last year.
Yeah, and they've also got just a couple of guys coming off the bench that you can play, and if you're going to use fouls, if you're going to be aggressive defending. I mean, you got Malik Renew, who can come in off the bench. He's been playing 12 to 15 minutes a game, but he is very foul prone. But you'd rather have him picking up fouls than you would Trace Jackson Davis. Same thing with Jordan Geronimo. He's not necessarily a big, but he's at least athletic and strong enough to maybe throw on him on Hunter for a few possessions. So Indiana's got, I think, some depth at least at the five, where they can, or at the 4 and the 5, where they can kind of just bring different looks and bring different guys in. But I think the main thing, obviously, is limiting the opportunities for Trace to pick up fouls. Do you, just from a Michigan perspective, how do you feel about Hunter, guarding Trace in single coverage? Obviously, you look at the numbers that Trace has been able to produce. It feels like every game, he's going to get 20 and 15. From a Michigan perspective, do you just live with what he does and try to, limit some of these other guys from going off? And how do you think, Hunter is going to fare, I guess, trying to deal with Trace's quickness and just his explosiveness when he gets in a little space? It feels like he could take advantage of Hunter, at least off the dribble.
Yeah, so it's one of those weird things where every game comes down to how teams guard Hunter, and very few teams are going to post up Hunter Dickinson, right? There's only so many teams that you're going to face that have another guy who is big enough and strong enough to say, yeah, I'm going to give him the ball a dozen times in the post and let him go to work. So Hunter Dickinson's defensive issues for the most part this year have usually been, okay, you have to guard in space, you have to guard a 5-out big, you have to guard a bunch of ball screens, and that's when he really struggles. So he's not a great defensive player, but he's probably better as a post-up scorer or a post-up defender, using his physicality some. Like Michigan went into the Purdue game just trying to play Hunter Dickinson on Zach Edey one-on-one, which didn't go too well, but it speaks to, I think, what Michigan will try to do. But the difference is, like you say, Trace is not that sort of just strength on strength. I'm just going to bully you in the post and try to get to my spot, and we'll just bang against each other and see who wins. He's got that first step that can really that face up and just give Hunter some problems. So I think it's going to be a test for Hunter Dickinson to be able to wall up and kind of like stay physical, even with that quickness advantage. But I definitely think you'll see 2 or 3 baskets where Trace Jackson Davis just beats him to the spot and kind of goes to that reverse dunk where he just goes on the other side of the hoop and throws it down. Like those points are going to be there. I think Michigan will be hesitant to try to double too aggressively, just because I think that's how they want to play, is to try to just limit that one-on-one. Hard to say how it really shakes out, but definitely the key to this matchup. And at the same time, I'm not really sure how Trace fares if Hunter Dickinson can establish position and kind of get him in his spots. Like, he doesn't quite have the size, but he does have the athleticism. So it's an interesting battle where they kind of both have strengths and weaknesses that attack the others.
Yeah, it feels like both players could have huge nights just based on the strengths that they have as players. And then it comes down to maybe what some of these secondary guys, and obviously Michigan's got a potential star and Jett Howard, and Indiana's got Jalen Hood-Schifino and some other complimentary guys that ultimately I feel like those guys are going to make the plays that could determine the game down the stretch. Did you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. And it probably makes sense to move to the wing, I guess, and we can talk a little bit about how that shakes up, because I think in an ideal world for either team, their big man will play well enough that it will come down to those other pieces, right? Like, what Michigan wants is for teams to have to send 2 bodies at Hunter Dickinson and then other guys make shots. Doesn't always happen that way, but that's kind of the hope. So for Michigan, it starts at the 3 with Jett Howard, who probably one of the elite shot makers in the Big Ten. When like his offensive moment, like when he's feeling it, it can be pretty ridiculous. He had a huge game at Iowa. He has this just gifted ability to create space, and he has the size to just elevate and shoot threes. He hit 6 threes against Nebraska. It didn't even seem like he played that well. On the other hand, he's easily the worst defensive player in Michigan's rotation, and he's sort of, the talent is all there, and it's just been this kind of slow process to put it together as far as, okay, this is what it takes to actually win Big Ten basketball games with my talent. And he can do that. He's had some good moments, some bad moments. But that's kind of, he's this sort of strength and weakness that Michigan is trying to fit in at any given point.
Right. Do you think that's going to be Miller Kopp trying to guard him? That, to me, from an Indiana perspective, just looking at the matchups, that probably makes the most sense starting out. Kopp's obviously a 5th-year guy who's experienced, not the best athlete, but he plays hard. Obviously, I think he understands for the most part positioning. But I also wonder just how well he's going to be able to keep up with Howard and be able to contest shots. Howard obviously has got a quick release. He can get his shot off against it. But he's a 1st-round pick probably in the draft coming up in a couple of months. There's a reason he's being billed as that, and it's because he's a great shot maker from the perimeter. Historically, over the last couple of years, Indiana, this is the kind of player that they've struggled with because they don't really have an athlete on the wing that can defend well. And this team is really no different. You wonder, does Trey Galloway get a crack at trying to stick with him some, but then that kind of, changes some of the other matchups in the game. So I think it'll probably be Kopp starting out defensively on Howard, and then you just kind of see how it goes. It's almost one of those situations where you have to just hope he's not making shots and you can test as well as you can, because I feel like he's going to get the attempts up. I mean, he's taken 166 threes this season. He's getting shots up. He's hitting a really good percentage. You mentioned his weaknesses defensively, but you also think about where Michigan would be as a team without him offensively, right?
Yeah, that's the kind of the constant give and take, right? Like, you don't have another great offensive player and you have this awesome talent. How do you get the most out of it? I tend to think that when you're trying to decide how to guard Michigan, you sort of like you're not going to stop him, like you say, right? He's going to get shots up. And I don't know that he's the guy that is going to kind of force the rest of your defense into a bad spot. So like disrupting Jet Howard doesn't necessarily disrupt Michigan's offense as well as it would like Hunter Dickinson or Kobe Buffkin or guys who are really in more playmaking roles, right? Like Jet Howard's probably going to get his 15 shots. He might make some, he might not. You probably don't have that much say over whether he does because he can just hit some really incredible shots. But I would tend to think you want to focus your best perimeter defender on someone like Kobe Buffkin, who is going to have to score for himself. He's going to create from others. He's kind of playing point guard. He's playing shooting guard. He's lifting a lot of kind of the playmaking responsibility to get Michigan into things. So if you can apply a great defensive piece against Buffkin, all of a sudden everyone else on Michigan gets worse, right? Jet Howard's not getting the ball in the right spots, regardless of who's guarding him, or Hunter Dickinson can't get as many touches. So I tend to think you just live with Miller Kopp on Jet Howard and hope for the best. Obviously that can change. I feel like there are some kind of more athletic pieces that Indiana has a bench, right? Like even a Jordan Geronimo or someone like that who can just sort of bring some energy and disrupt him a little bit would be a great option off the bench for at least a stretch. But at the end of the day, I do think that like your defensive decision on Jet Howard isn't what's going to make or break this game, I would say. And that's not to say Jet Howard couldn't go for 25 points and have this monster game. I just don't know what you can really do about it. If he's going to have one of those games like he had against Iowa, like you just kind of tip your cap and say, all right, man, that's not fair.
So with his defensive issues, is there a worry from a Michigan perspective that Kopp just gets left open 3 or 4 times and hits? I mean, those are the kind of opportunities that I feel like Indiana has to have to win on the road, because you know what you're going to get from Trace for the most part. Schifino's a bit of a wild card because he's been up and down, but he's got the talent to produce. But from an Indiana perspective, I feel like you have to have a guy like Kopp or a Galloway or Tamar Bates make some threes. And so is that an opportunity for Indiana to maybe pick up a couple buckets just from Jet Howard having lapses defensively? I mean, you talked about him not being strong on that end. Is that a concern just from a Michigan perspective that he's going to leave him open and maybe make some mistakes that could be costly?
Yeah, so it's interesting because on one hand, stand in the corner and stay with Miller Kopp is like as easy of a defensive assignment as it gets as far as like straightforwardness. So like on that hand, it's not the worst matchup for Jet Howard. You would worry a little more about teams that maybe have multiple perimeter attackers who then you're stuck having to guard one of those guys with Jet Howard. He struggled off the ball, kind of in ball screen sort of defense where he's not always in the right spot. He doesn't have that great off ball awareness. But again, if you're just saying stay home on a shooter, like that is kind of an assignment I think he can do an okay job with. He's also really struggled on the defensive glass. He has one of the worst defensive rebounding rates for anyone over like 6'6". Again, that's not somewhere that guarding Miller Kopp should really test you all that much. So in that case, it's not the worst matchup. I don't really think of Indiana as running a ton of ball screens as far as just their base offense compared to some other teams that Michigan will face. So I think it's a decent spot to hide him. The problem is Jet Howard will just have 5 possessions where he's not in the right spot at the right time or doesn't get back in transition. And then it comes down to, okay, well, the guy you're losing track of in those spots is Miller Kopp. He shoots 46% from 3-point range. He has to make those shots, and he will get some of those shots just because of those lapses. So I think it's not that you're looking at it and saying, wow, we're really in trouble of how Jet Howard's going to guard. But at the same time, you're going to say, Miller, you're going to get 5 or 6 good looks just because of the flow of the game and be ready for those. So that's kind of how I put it. I don't know. Like, I think there's a chance that maybe Scoop Bates comes in the game and could do some more things against Jet Howard in those sort of matchups if he gets comfortable.
Yeah, but he's also just a kind of a spot up shooter too. You know, you're not really worried about him going to the basket when he puts the ball on the floor. It doesn't necessarily end well. I mean, he can obviously go off the dribble and shoot pull-ups, but it's not like he's using his athleticism to get in the lane and finish. He's look at his game log. I mean, he had that really good game against Michigan State. Yeah, like around that game, he had a bunch of basically games where he made no impact. He played a little bit better against Rutgers, but yeah, I mean, similar. I don't want to say similar to Kopp because they're obviously different, but in terms of how he scores, he's basically a spot up shooter. So I don't necessarily know that that's going to put Howard in some compromising positions. Although the thing I would just say, just in general about those guys, like to beat Indiana, I feel like you have to avoid like Kopp or Bates going off for like 12 or 15. Like you can live with Kopp making a three or scoring 6 points, or Tamar Bates making a couple threes. What you don't want to have happen is all of a sudden Galloway's 2 of 3 from 3, then Kopp hits a couple, then Bates hits a couple, and then all of a sudden you're kind of worried about what's going on from the perimeter, and then Trace Jackson Davis just takes an even stronger hold on the game. So I think from Michigan's perspective, Indiana's not a team that shoots a ton of threes, but
they make them.
They make them when they do. And in some of the games where they've played poorly on the road, it's just because they've not been, teams have kind of slowed down. No one's really stopped Trace Jackson Davis, but they've kind of slowed him down and made him, shoot 50% from the field instead of, 65. And they've forced Indiana to take perimeter shots that were contested and not made them. So I think the one thing you want to avoid is just having a couple guys get comfortable early and make shots, and I think that can be a chance for Indiana to just get some confidence and get their just get their offense rolling at a pretty high level. And Michigan defensively, just as a team, right, that's not their strong suit. They're obviously much better offensively than they are defensively.
Yeah, the Michigan's defense has not been good, and it's also been, I think, like statistically slightly better than it actually is. Teams aren't really making threes against them. It sort of feels duct taped together a bit in a way of like, I think they're like 4th or 5th in the Big Ten in defensive efficiency in conference games. And I wouldn't really buy that number holding up, but they've been able to scrap by and do a decent job. And they are like better, I would say, defensively than last year's team a little bit, but not by much. So it's definitely a weakness. On the wing, the other X factor from a Michigan perspective is Joey Baker, Duke transfer, who has kind of settled into a comfortable role. He's made 8 of his last 14 threes, 13 threes over the last 3 games. If he hits 2 threes, 3 threes off the bench, it kind of changes everything for Michigan. And he's really been more aggressive hunting his shot over the last few games. He got a start against Purdue because Jet Baker was out with an ankle injury. And I feel like that gave him a bit of extra confidence, just kind of how he needs to play. He's a potential game changer for Michigan just because there's really nothing else on the bench as far as consistent production for this team. And a guy like Baker coming in, hitting 2 threes, it just sort of flips the entire script of a game, right? It's when Michigan's offense would generally kind of lull in that middle 4 or 5 minutes. And he's just been like, basically the first time he's been on the court the last couple of games, he's fired up a 3 and he's made it, and it just flips the switch. So that is something to watch for. I think this is a matchup from a Michigan perspective where you're probably comfortable force feeding even extra minutes to Joey Baker based on the matchups. The hard thing for Michigan has always been, where do you get Baker minutes, right? Like Kobe Buffkin and Jet Howard are so hard to take off the floor. Do you kind of slide everything up to the 4 and go small? Do you kind of go big and slide Kobe Buffkin down and play with the 2 shooters? In this matchup, I actually think there's probably a path to playing Kobe Buffkin at the point guard and then playing Jet Howard and Joey Baker at the 2 and 3. So interesting to watch how those minutes shake out, just because Baker has emerged as someone who can make an impact for Michigan, even though he's only playing 15, 16 minutes most nights.
Yeah, I know we're going to get into the bench guys later, but this just kind of came to mind when you started talking about that. If Michigan does try to go small, I could see Indiana, trying to play Trace Jackson Davis and Renew together, and then you can get both guys posting up. They play pretty well off of each other. I feel like that. They're both pretty good passers. Obviously, Trace Jackson Davis averaging 3 or 4 assists per game, but I kind of wonder, even with Terrence Williams, how he guards Malik Renew in the post. I feel like that could be a matchup worth watching, because Renew obviously started out the season really strong and it looks like really for the first couple of games of the season, Indiana's best freshman. Obviously, he hit that lull as many freshmen do, and teams adjust. And obviously, fouling is a big issue for him. But as you mentioned earlier, kind of Michigan having both post up guys last season with Diabate and Dickinson, it kind of brought to mind like Indiana can maybe give a little bit of the same look with Jackson Davis and Renew at times, and I wonder how Michigan adjusts to defend that because I don't know this for sure, but Michigan doesn't play Reed and Dickinson together, right?
So there's been phases of that. So Terrence Williams has been really this kind of 30-minute guy, but there was a stretch, kind of a 3 or 4 game stretch in January where Michigan went with Terrace Reed. Started at the Iowa game. They actually put Terrace Reed at the 4 to guard Chris Murray, and he did a really good job. So Terrace Reed is a really gifted freshman. He moves really, really well laterally. He has great defensive instincts. He's still kind of learning how to play college defense, but they went on a stretch of a few games there where they were playing the 2 bigs, and it was actually pretty successful. It looked good at Iowa. It turned the Northwestern game around in the second half. So it is something they'll do. The problem is Terrace Reed's committed like 15 fouls in 4 minutes over the last 3 games, and he's really struggling to stay on the floor in general.
So basically what you're saying is there could be about 6 straight possessions where Malik Renew and Terrace Reed just come down and foul each other, right?
That is absolutely within the realm of possibilities, especially because Terrace Reed is also extremely talented at drawing fouls and missing free throws. So it's kind of what are you going to get out of that matchup? I think Michigan would think about doing that, but I also think Michigan would let Terrence Williams try to guard one-on-one in the post a bit and see how that goes until it became a disadvantage. Like for all of his shortcomings and whatnot, like Terrence Williams is a pretty physical defender. He can at least bang around in there. He is one of Michigan's better defensive rebounders. So I think they'll be okay with him trying that for a bit. There have been other situations where maybe they bring a double from Hunter Dickinson, but again, that becomes tricky as well with Trace Jackson Davis probably there as the pass, right? So tough spot for Michigan if they can exploit that. But hard to say. I feel like Michigan's probably not going in this game saying we can't lose to Malik Renew. So I think they'd make him prove it before they go that way.
Yeah, I think really the other guard matchups could be what this game comes down to. You've got Doug McDaniel and Kobe Buffkin and Trey Galloway and Jalen Hood-Schifino for Indiana. I mean, I feel like I'm not sure if you would agree with this from an Indiana perspective. It's going to be Galloway on Buffkin and then Hood-Schifino on McDaniel from the Indiana defensive perspective. And then from Michigan perspective, you're probably going to see Buffkin on Hood-Schifino and then McDaniel on Galloway, right? I mean, is that kind of what you think as well?
Yeah, I would be pretty surprised if Kobe Buffkin doesn't defend Jalen Hood-Schifino. Buffkin is by far Michigan's best perimeter defender. He has it's like 6'4", long arms. He can fit into that matchup. Like Doug McDaniel is the guy you want at the point of attack, but he's listed at 5'11". He's not 5'11". He's giving up a lot. And I just think because of how focused Indiana's offense is around Hood-Schifino as a perimeter creator, you'll put Buffkin there. Obviously, like you're giving up a half foot of size probably to Trey Galloway. But I think, again, it's one of those things where Trey Galloway is using 12% of offensive possessions. If you're going to beat us, like prove it that you can beat us and actually do that. So that would be my guess. I'd be curious to your perspective, what Galloway will do to try to exploit that. Like, will that be something Indiana tries to attack or just kind of run your stuff and see what happens, right? Because where McDaniel has struggled this year defensively, well, one way is he has not been great at guys that really run off the ball and like come off a lot of handoffs and pin down screens, like kind of a Andrew Funk or something like that. So that would be something you could try to attack him with, but I just don't know if Galloway is just that confident of an offense. I think of him as more of a residual guy almost all the time, where he's just playing off of whatever else happens.
Yeah, I mean, he's a good transition player, obviously. I think he does pretty well there. The other thing I will say that he's done a little bit more recently that we haven't seen as much. In that Purdue game, there was a couple times where he just kind of came off a screen or a ball screen and went into the lane, and Purdue just kind of dropped off, obviously, because they don't want the lob to Trace Jackson Davis, and he was able to hit the floater. So he's I think his strength maybe in this game is trying to get in the lane a little bit against Doug McDaniel, and he's not someone obviously going to block his shot, so he's going to have those looks. I feel like in that 7 to 10 foot range. Can he hit the floater? Can he get all the way to the rim? I think the same thing with Michigan. They're obviously not going to leave Trace Jackson Davis to try to stop Trey Galloway, so there's going to be opportunities there for Galloway. Like I said, the floater is something that he's pretty good at. I'm not saying he's going to be a guy that's going to go off for 14 to 16 points, but if he gets a couple cheap baskets that way, I think that's a win overall for Indiana. I think the bigger concern from Michigan's perspective is just making Jalen Hood-Schifino as uncomfortable as possible, right? Because if he gets going, we've seen there was the Iowa road game where he played really good. And obviously Indiana blew that game and lost it, but he was pretty spectacular with the shot making. The home game against Ohio State where they didn't play very well early as a team, but he kind of carried the load. But then you've also got the game against Maryland where he shoots 1 of 14 on the road, and Maryland I thought did a really good job of just contesting his shots. He shoots a lot of mid-range jump shots, which I'm not the biggest fan of. I'm more of like, and you would probably agree with just modern basketball. It's like either take a three or try to get a layup. Like why shoot the 15 to 17 footer? But at the same time, I think defense is
making those shots.
Right. No, he's a good shot maker. And so I think Mike Woodson has kind of just embraced like, hey, this is like part of the bread and butter of your game. If you can get that shot, let's take it. And when he's making those shots, Indiana is really tough to guard because you're obviously not gonna send a ton of help to help to stop a guy from shooting mid-range jumpers, but he's just a pro at creating offense at times for himself, and that's why he shot up draft boards. And you just look at just kind of his size and his physicality. He's not a superb athlete, but he's good enough to create that separation to get the shot off. And so I think for Michigan, you have to avoid letting him get comfortable early and make a couple shots because he definitely has a chance to just get rolling, and it's hard to stop him when he does.
So what's the proper take on Hood-Schifino's three-point shooting? It seems like he misses all of his threes for games and games and games, and then he'll make 6 of 7 or 5 of 8 or just have these monster games where he makes everything. It's kind of similar to Doug McDaniel for Michigan, who you look at his shot and it's kind of this weird shot-put shot that goes high arcing, but he's shooting like 38, 39%. It's like, well, okay. Like, is he a shooter? Like, what's the read on Hood-Schifino? Because I look at it and I say, wow, he's shooting like 40+% in the mid-range. His shot should make sense, but the inconsistency on his three is hard to figure out.
Yeah, I think that's one thing too that NBA teams are going to have a huge question about, because when you're evaluating a college player, those percentages look good, but then you look at the game log and you just kind of say like, there's no consistency with this. And that's kind of why I said from a Michigan perspective, you have to hope that he misses the first couple shots because he's not going to stop shooting, right? He's going to keep taking the shots. He's got the green light, and rightfully so. He's earned that. He's one of the more talented players as a freshman in the Big Ten. But I mean, he wasn't a great 3-point shooter in high school. You look at the numbers. I know there's obviously limited data from high school games, but at the same time, it wasn't like he came into college and you say, well, this guy's going to shoot 40% on threes. I'm quite frankly, I'm surprised that the number is what it is, but I think a lot of it's just based on these games where he gets this confidence and he starts making a couple, and then it kind of goes from there. So, is it translatable to the next level that he's going to shoot this percentage? Probably not. Otherwise, he's a lottery pick because you don't find guys that are a 6'6" point guard with the playmaking ability that he has that can shoot that level of percentage from the perimeter. So, I don't. From an Indiana perspective, on a game-to-game basis, I don't. There's no expectation that he's going to make 40% of his threes in any given game, but he can surely go out and do it. So I don't know if I answered your question there, but I don't know that there's a rhyme or reason to it. I just think he's very streaky, and he's definitely a player who, when he gets going, it's just like, you probably feel the same way about Jett Howard at times, right? He makes a couple, and then all of a sudden he's taking tough shots, and he's still making. I mean, that Ohio State game, they really had no answer for him. It was just ridiculous. I think the way he came out and made shots.
Who guarded Hood-Schifino in the Maryland game? Do you remember? Like was it Jameer Young for the most part, or was it one of their bigger wings?
I think it was
like
Jameer Young. I think it was Jameer Young.
Okay,
but a lot of that also was they were pressuring the ball like three quarters court, right, and just trying to like make Indiana as uncomfortable as possible, and it worked. And like I said, he's not going to stop shooting. You know, a guy that usually starts out 1 for 6 or 1 for 7, you say, okay, let's maybe try to facilitate for other guys. But and the funny thing about it was, after the Purdue game, Hood-Schifino was one of the guys they brought to the podium, and someone asked him, like, you had a bad game against Maryland, and he like the first thing he said was, I didn't really see it as a bad game. You know, I took 14 shots, I just didn't make them. Like he has like a confidence about him that he feels like the next shot's going in, and I think a lot of times that's part of the battle a lot too for young players, right? You can lose your confidence. He hasn't really gone through that, but you know, at some point it can become also a detriment if a guy keeps, you know, chucking up mid-range shots and threes and he's not making them. But it's also part of the fact that he's got a much bigger green light now with Xavier Johnson being out for such a long period of time, and who else is going to do it? Because
exactly,
Trey Galloway is not going to create shots for himself very often. Miller Kopp, I mean, Mike Woodson's been very open to the point that, hey, we're not running things for Miller Kopp. Miller Kopp's going to get his shots from the corner when he's open, and we hope that he makes them, but we're not going out of our way to run plays for him. So it's basically Trace Jackson Davis and Jalen Hood-Schifino. Those are the guys that can create shots for Indiana, and they're gonna win or lose based on how those guys perform.
Yeah, so Michigan will counter with Kobe Buffkin. He's been really phenomenal over the last 3 or 4 games. He's kind of popping up on all like NBA draft Twitter, and everyone's like, "Oh, Kobe Buffkin's a sleeper." He's had really good moments all year. He struggled to maybe be as consistent. He is kind of in a similar role to Hood-Schifino, where it's like he needs to do basically everything for this Michigan team on the perimeter, right? Jalen Llewellyn tore his ACL in December, so now Kobe Buffkin is one of the main playmakers. He has to slide over and play backup point guard when Doug McDaniel's off the floor. He's playing next to 2 freshmen at the 1 and the 3. He is really like the number 2 pick and roll guy. He's having to guard the best perimeter defender every game. So he has been really tasked with doing a lot. The strength of his game is his ability to get downhill to the rim with his left hand. I think he's shooting, last I checked, like 70% at the rim. And that's a pretty impressive number for a guy who is getting there himself most of the time, right? Like he's not a finisher who's just getting drop-off passes. He's beating his guy, getting downhill and scoring. He can shoot kind of in the mid-range, like a Hood-Schifino, right? He has a good pull-up jumper. He's a good free throw shooter. The three-point shot, for whatever reason, has been something he's kind of just struggled with his confidence, right? Like he can make them, but he's shooting only 30% from 3. He's only attempted 78 in the year, which is like basically like a third of his attempts, which probably lower than you want to see from a guard. Like if you're trusting someone as a shooter, I think you want to see them closer to 40, 50% of their shots from 3. So that's where you beat him. But at the same time, he's just been this kind of awesome jack of all trades player. He's flirted with a triple-double the last couple games, close, or at least at Northwestern. Been good on the glass. So he'll be the guy that Michigan will counter with. And I really do think like so much is going to be talked about the bigs, but if Buffkin or Hood-Schifino can control the game out of ball screens and kind of out of what they can do on the perimeter, that changes things. And when Michigan has played its best against Indiana over the recent seasons, it's been because that ball screen offense works and not just because of the post-up stuff. So that's where I think kind of that Buffkin, Doug McDaniel combination becomes so important, right? Like, can those guys create out of ball screens? Can they get comfortable? Can they get Michigan into the right sets? Can they create kind of that penetration, 2 feet in the paint to get good shots for Jet Howard instead of Jet Howard sort of 2-stepping around and dribbling 6 times and taking a step back, right? Like the quality of those shots for Michigan and how comfortable the guards can be operating on the perimeter is what will really set I think, this game apart. And it's also, if you look back at that game in Indianapolis last year, that's really what, like, Trace Jackson Davis went crazy in the second half. But really what changed in that game was Xavier Johnson got into Devontae Jones, turned Michigan over. Michigan couldn't run their stuff, and that flipped everything. And that was the complete opposite of the first half and the complete opposite of the game in Bloomington. So what I'm curious is, I feel like the notable drop-off for this Indiana team has been that perimeter defense without Xavier Johnson. Like, I don't really trust Hood Schifino or really Indiana's perimeter defense nearly as much as I did with last year's group. What's kind of the sense of how they'll defend ball screens and how much they can get into a team to make them uncomfortable in that sense?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point and a concern for Indiana. I will say that there was a period there after Johnson went out where I feel like they were just basically trying to figure out how they wanted to defend and figure out who was going to do what and kind of what the coverages were going to be. And they've been much better, obviously, in the last 8 games. They're 7-1. They're defending at a level. I wouldn't put them in the same category as the team last year. Defensively, because obviously Johnson, to me, as important as what he's done, what he did late in last season in the ball screen offensively, I feel like defensively he was a catalyst all season for Indiana. They had the best defense in the Big Ten last season, the regular season. Without that, they would have had no chance to make the tournament, and they were that was kind of the bread and butter. And still to this day, Mike Woodson, if you ask him, as well as this team has been playing offensively this year, I think they're top 20 in KenPom offense. He doesn't really even want to talk about the offense when you bring it up. It's like, I want better defense, and he's gotten it more often lately. I think a lot of it is just Indiana. There was a stretch there where teams were like the Northwestern game, for example. Teams were starting their offense against Indiana, like, it was almost like right at the 3-point line. They were not being aggressive enough, trying to contest dribble handoffs, trying to kind of hedge on ball screens and be aggressive to try to stop penetration. And Northwestern really just carved them up on that. And I think they've adjusted just to be a lot more aggressive in how they want to try to stop dribble penetration. And Hood Schifino, I think, is a good defender. I wouldn't put him anywhere near the category of where Trey Galloway was, but Xavier Johnson. But Trey Galloway, to me, is a pretty solid defender. The good thing with Trace is he's athletic enough, I feel like, to, if he gets stuck in a lot of ball screens, he's going to be able to make a good read. And, if he has to come help, he can do that, but he can also recover, I think, pretty well. So they've been better lately overall and just more connected as a team. And I don't want to say they weren't playing hard after Johnson went out in that stretch. I just think that he was such a big part of what they do defensively on the perimeter that there had to be kind of an adjustment made and kind of guys accepting the fact that they're going to have to do different things. The one guy that really, I think, still kind of hurts them defensively when he's in the game is Tamar Bates. He seems like he's not always in the right position. But Kopp, a lot of people, when Kopp has a bad game for Indiana offensively, he's like a punching bag for the fan base. But to his credit, for the player that he is in terms of his athletic ability and kind of his size, I feel like he does a pretty good job, reading offenses and being in the right position. So ultimately, if this team is going to hit its ceiling that we talked about in the preseason, have a chance to make a second weekend run in the NCAA tournament, they're going to need Xavier Johnson back and healthy on the court, because I just don't think the perimeter guys are good enough defensively. When you get into the tournament, it's all about matchups, obviously, and there's going to be guys that can pick defenses apart, and they need him back and healthy and kind of spearheading that defense. But overall, I feel like they've been better. I mean, the Maryland game, they gave up 66 points and lost the road. They lost that game because they turned the ball over a lot and they couldn't score necessarily. I mean, Maryland played pretty well, pretty physical against them. But overall, I just think Indiana right now still has room to grow defensively. What are they, like 40, 41 in KenPom defense? I would have predicted during before the season that they would have been a top 25 defense, and they just haven't done. I mean, it's kind of a weird thing. Like before the season, you think Indiana, if they're going to reach their ceiling as a team, they have to be even better than they were last year as a team defensively, right? And it's kind of flipped that where the offense and what Trace is doing and making timely threes. They're not taking a ton of threes, but they do make them when they take them. They've just been a much more efficient offensive team. So if they can defend at a much higher level here down the stretch of the season, it's going to be tough with the schedule. I feel like the ceiling maybe raises a little bit.
Yeah, if you look like year over year, the difference is the shooting, right? They're 51% on twos last year. That's like 125th. 33% on threes. That's 200th. This year you flip it. They're 54% on twos, 39th. And 38% on threes. That's 16th. So yeah, they're 346th in 3-point volume, but the threes they take are going in, which is pretty efficient. And when you have a big, like you're destined to be a low volume 3-point shooting team when you have a guy like Trace Jackson Davis, right? Because he's going to take so many shots literally within 5 feet of the basket. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like a lot of times you look at it and you say, wow, this team doesn't shoot many threes. But it doesn't really matter if they make them because it creates so much space for that 2-point offense to improve. So that's definitely where this team has gotten better. And it's not, I agree, it's not something I would have maybe expected going into the year. And like, I don't know.
It's really a couple of guys, though. I mean, it's Tamar Bates is making a much better percentage than he did last year as a freshman. Miller Kopp is making a higher percentage, and Trey Galloway, who you wouldn't have even wanted taking a 3-pointer last season, even if he was wide open, is now somehow a competent 3-point shooter. Credit him for working on it in the offseason. But yeah, I felt like last season they got good shots, they just couldn't make them. And now they're getting good shots, and when they're open, they make them. Like I said, they may make 3 or 4 3-pointers total on Saturday, but if they're 4 for 8 or something, and they're shooting 55% on twos or 60% on twos, then they give themselves a chance to win.
Also, TJD has just gone like superhuman this last month or so. Like,
where do you come down on the whole like Edey versus TJD conversation in terms of just like Big Ten Player of the Year and National Player of the Year? Is it like an open and shut case for you at this point still? Obviously, what Edey's done has been incredible. I would still have him at the top of the list, but I feel like Trace is at least made it a conversation that like he at least belongs in the discussion. I feel like at this point, like he's first team All-American for sure, right? Based on how he's played recently.
So I would put it like this. Trace Jackson Davis is having a National Player of the Year season, but he has no case to be National Player of the Year over Zach Edey. Like Zach Edey's that much above. Like if you just look at all the numbers, I was actually listening to 3-Man Weave podcast. Shout out to the 3-Man Weave, great pod. And they had a segment on there just comparing all the stats and the gap in all the stats. Like Edey just has better numbers, Purdue's the better team. I just don't think there's really a case. Like Edey's been that good. Edey's stats are just not normal. And like I agree completely. Trace is a first team All-American. He would have been Big Ten Player of the Year most other years. It's just Edey's been out of control. And I know like maybe if Indiana sweeps Purdue or like if Indiana like wins out and goes on this crazy run, you can make a case like he has had that. He's been maybe better than Edey for an 8-game stretch. But if you look over the whole season, I just don't think you can really compare to Edey right now, especially if Purdue keeps cruising along at whatever and they finish 28-3 or something like that. I just don't think Edey's numbers are that enormous that you can't really argue with it. But it's taking away from just how good Trace has been because he's been ridiculous. In some of these games that he just like once he gets to that kind of sweet spot with like 8 minutes left and he's just getting the ball easy and just still just going despite playing the whole game and just 3, 4, 5 baskets in a row to finish it off. I just think back to that. I think it was the Wisconsin game where it was like he wasn't even being guarded. So that definitely comes down to it. From Michigan though, like this is the kind of game that Michigan needs Hunter Dickinson to show up. And he's had games like this in the past where he does, and he's had games in the past like this where he doesn't. So I'm really curious to see just kind of how he performs because he has had maybe one of his better 3-game stretches in a while. He was a little bit kind of just stuck between gears for a while. And I'm like, for me, the key for slowing down Dickinson is how hard you make it for him to catch the ball where he wants it. So Indiana defensively, it's about how you double team, yes, but it's also about everything before the catch. Can you force him off the block? Can you make it harder to make the pass based on kind of your perimeter action, your perimeter pressure? So that's something to watch as far as how that matchup plays out. Because if you let Dickinson catch the ball where he wants, he's probably going to score. He's just that big and physical. But if he catches it too far out, maybe he'll face up and kind of take a 15-foot jumper or these other things. Other thing to watch with Hunter, he's going to get the ball on the left block the first possession of the game, first 3 minutes of the game. He's going to face up and he's going to shoot an 18-foot jumper. If he makes it, you better watch out because he's going to be going the whole game. If he airballs it long, well, it might be a long night for Hunter Dickinson. That's kind of been, I think, the move, like the shot where it just shapes his whole day. So that's something to track.
How would you just assess the season he's had overall? Obviously, we had him number one in our list going into the season, which I felt good about based on, it's always hard with the list every year because you're trying to project forward and you look at the body of evidence. And to me, the last couple of years, he was obviously a better player than Edey and Jackson Davis. It hasn't turned out to have been the case this year. But overall, you look at the numbers, he's still, 18 a game, 8.5 rebounds. He's shooting 38% from three, shoots low 70s on free throws, good amount of block shots. I mean, he's still a really good player. It's just now, like, when you compare him to what Trace and Edey are doing this season, I kind of feel like he's not in that discussion. And so maybe people are forgotten about him, but he's overall, I feel like he's still having a pretty productive season overall.
Yeah, like you look at his Big Ten conference only numbers year over year, they're almost identical. What we didn't account for in that list was that Zach Edey could actually play 36 minutes a game or whatever the hell he can do. Like, we thought maybe he'd play 27 minutes a game. Other people have gotten better. Hunter Dickinson had a stretch really like the last 2 months of last year where he was really, really, really good. This year he's had games where he's played at that level, but not maybe like for 7, 8, 9 games in a row. And I think some of the frustration is, okay, you have to play a certain way with Hunter Dickinson, right? Like, you have to play through him. You're going to have some defensive issues. And he just hasn't been able to maybe produce quite consistently enough in big spots. And that's part of the problem. At the same time, there's just less talent around him. He's had like 3 or 4 new starters each year, each of the last 2 seasons. So it's been kind of a struggle for Michigan just to figure out how to make it all work, right? Like, every year you're starting with a new point guard, you have a new freshman on the wing. Like, it's been this struggle. And I think the drop off from Michigan from going to, like, Moussa Diabate wasn't always like perfect fit next to him, but he's also a pro, and Terrence Williams is not
he's also
a pro.
A great rebounder. Diabate.
Yeah, awesome
Incredible.
rebounder. And Hunter Dickinson is not a great rebounder, especially out of his area. He's just not that explosive or athletic. So things like that have crept up as potential issues. So I think the thing with Dickinson is his numbers are very similar. Michigan probably needed even more from him this year relative to last year. Instead, he's just kind of been basically the same guy, I guess you could say. And I think that could all change over the next few weeks, right? Like, it takes 3 or 4 big games, right? Like, he had some huge games against Indiana, Purdue last year that sort of changed the narrative on his season. He needs to do that again, I think, to really come close to reaching maybe the expectation of what people thought he could be this year.
Yeah, this is a big game for Michigan, no doubt about it. I mean, they, you look at their resume right now, there's obviously still a lot of work to do, but they have the opportunities here coming up to get back into the tournament conversation. They could be a team that, finishes 11-9 or 12-8 in the Big Ten, and all of a sudden you say, hey, this is a pretty good conference record, and they win some of these key games here down the stretch. All of a sudden you have 4 or 5 quad one wins, and they're able to maybe get to a Dayton or get to the 11 seed. But they've got to win this game, I feel like, on Saturday to kind of jumpstart that. They've played. This is the 3rd game of a 3-game homestand for them, so they've been at home here for a little bit. It's a Saturday night game, 6:00. They should have a really good turnout. And let's face it, they're 9-1 against Indiana in their last 10. They've played Indiana well. So this is, I think, a key spot for them. And I think a lot of it, as you said, is just They're going to need Hunter Dickinson down the stretch here to have a run as an individual player and kind of put this team on his back, because I mean, there's no one else on this roster that's gonna be able to do. I mean, Jett Howard can have these big time games, but Hunter Dickinson's a player that if he gets going here this last month of the season, he can carry you into the tournament. But I think it starts Saturday against Indiana, and Michigan's got to find a way to win this game.
Yeah, Michigan's 8-5 in the Big Ten right now. Probably need to go 12-8 to have a chance at making the NCAA tournament. They have games, like you say, right? Like this game,
they have tough games on the road, right?
They have tough games on the road, but they have a couple home games. Like this game, it's hard to get to 12 wins without winning this game if you're kind of trying to add up the columns. Obviously, never say never with so many games left on the schedule, but this is one Michigan just has to have, and it's one that if they can win it, I think they could say, well, we can finish 3 and whatever down the stretch. Like I think you could. It's just a completely pivotal game to what this team, if they're going to make something out of the last month of the season. And what you say with Dickinson is, yeah, he's the guy that can give you all that. But the other thing is, it's just sort of, I don't know what the right word is, but as Dickinson goes, everyone else's job gets easier. And if Dickinson struggles, everyone else's job gets harder. So all of a sudden, like Doug McDaniel or Kobe Buffkin making a play is way easier if the other team is worried about Hunter Dickinson. And it's sort of this relationship where they're very tied to each other. And Michigan has found maybe a balance over the last 3 games where both of those things are working in a way that they weren't earlier in the year. Now, maybe that's just from playing Northwestern, Ohio State, and Nebraska. And that's the big question, right? Like Michigan looks good. They have a winning record. They're playing well. Now can they go out and beat teams in the top half of the league consistently? If they can't, well, that's it. But this is really the chance where, okay, you're at home. You have to you have to go out and play well and get the job done if you want to make something of your year.
Yeah. Last thing before we go, I wanted to just ask you about Indiana in general, your thoughts on them. I know from listening to the moving screen that you're still pretty in on this team just in terms of their long-term upside. And I respect your opinion as much as anybody when it comes to Big Ten hoops. What do you kind of see as the keys maybe for Indiana here to close out the season? I guess what kind of run do you think they could go on here to close out the regular season? And if they get Xavier Johnson back, what ultimately do you feel like their upside is as a team as you forecast towards the NCAA tournament?
So it felt like in mid-January, the whole thing was going down, right? Like that 3-game losing streak was really ugly. At the same time, you win 7 out of 8. All of a sudden, everything looks great. You're rolling. But now you look at the schedule for the next 5 games on the road. Hey, that's ugly. And really 4 pretty good road games. Not like you're playing Nebraska or Minnesota on the road. So
they're all good teams.
Yeah, that's a tough stretch. So I do think there'll be some sort of maybe correction to what people think of Indiana. But at the same time, I think look, no one's winning the Big Ten over Purdue. I think what this year is going to come down to for Indiana is how can you put it all together in the NCAA tournament? And if Xavier Johnson is coming back at some point, that's what you're going to really be looking for. You've built up this idea of Jalen Hood-Schifino. He's grown his game. He's improved defensively. He's making shots. He's making plays. Now, if you can add Xavier Johnson back into that, maybe find something. I just don't know what his health status is, but that feels like really the X factor if this team's going to make a postseason run, because it feels like it's a tricky thing, right? Maybe Indiana's better with Hood-Schifino doing a couple of things that Xavier Johnson used to do. He comes back. You need a few games, I think, to find that rhythm.
And that's the tough part with the schedule too. When there's not a home game against Nebraska or a home game against Minnesota. I mean, there's no. I don't feel like there's a great spot to bring somebody back at this point, right? With the schedule Indiana has left.
Yeah, you can't get cute. It's not like you have a bye game or something to put it in there. But I think that's okay. I think it's just about. I think getting those reps against good teams is okay, and I think how it fits together, in mid-March, will really be telling, right? That's the question for this team, and I think. I like what they've done offensively. I just think there's a little more upside if they can get back healthy and kind of figure it all out. Because the pieces are there. I do think when you put March Madness single elimination game, I think there will be a level of defense that this team can play, especially as it gets healthier, that can really be competitive if this offensive kind of resurgence can hold up.
Yeah, for sure. Dylan, fun to do a joint pod here. Glad we can get this on both podcast feeds. If you don't follow Dylan, he's at UMHoops on Twitter. Definitely check him out. Does a ton of not just great Michigan work, but a lot of just Big Ten specific graphics and different cool statistics that he likes to tweet out that I always enjoy. And Dylan, what's kind of what your thoughts just here heading into this game about Michigan as a team to close out? Do you feel like they can keep this momentum going? Do you feel like they're this 3-game winning streak is real, or do you feel like this team is going to struggle ultimately to close out the regular season?
So my prediction recently was I think that they will get to 11 wins before the last week of the season.
Okay.
And then they'll need to win at Illinois or at Indiana to make the NCAA tournament. I don't know if they'll do that, but that's my guess. I think they would want to be at 12 before that final week. I think they're probably at 11. And similar to last year in a way, it comes down to stealing one of those road games, because last year they went and beat Ohio State on the road, and that was really what ended up getting them into the tournament. I think it's going to end up a similar situation where they get in the conversation, but it's going to take a big road upset late in the year to make it a real conversation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I was in on Michigan before the season, just in terms of where I picked them. So I think they've got the talent. They've got I feel like the opportunity here to at least close out the season strong. So good to talk with you this week on this joint episode of the Pin Down and Podcast on the Brink. And any closing thoughts? Are we good to wrap?
No, this is really fun. Thanks everyone for listening, and can't wait to see where we're all wrong about this game on Saturday evening.
I just hope it's a well played game by both teams, and I feel like this is
both teams play hard.
No. I hope. What I don't want is 58-55. Right? We've watched enough Wisconsin and Northwestern and some of these other teams. It's just not fun basketball to watch. You know, let's get a good game in the 70s with a lot of scoring and a lot of up and down and fun. What's some fun basketball to watch, right? I mean, the Big Ten.
My friend, Michigan does not play defense, so you will get your points. There will be scoring, I would say. Like, Michigan's not going to slow the game down. I don't think Indiana would slow the game down.
No.
So I do think you're not going to get sort of that Maryland junk zone to slow things down or whatever. Like, no, you're going to get up and down. I think it'll be I would definitely lean toward plenty of scoring, but we'll see.
That's good. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. And I know Dylan will be back with another episode of the Pin Down soon, and same thing here for Podcast on the Brink. So thanks for listening. If you enjoy our shows, definitely check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, leave a rating or review. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink, as well as the Pin Down. Thanks everybody for listening.